I'm here to talk to you about the role that civilians would have played in the defence against a German invasion during the Second World War. And we have this perception, as Tim was saying earlier, of Britain being unprepared and weak and a bit pathetic in 1940, but actually anything's further from the truth. Our preparation started pre-war for civilian resistance. There were two groups set up. Military Intelligence Research was formed in the late 1930s to help form and think about ways of fighting an enemy that isn't necessarily in the army handbook. And they were going around to countries surrounding Nazi Germany, essentially, so Czechoslovakia and Poland, places like that, Scandinavia, to help them to start to think about what civilian resistance might look like if the Germans invaded. They also, for example, they were in the Skoda factory in Czechoslovakia talking about how they might want to blow up their factory if the Germans came and how they might be able to do that effectively. But it all came a bit too late. So that was from a military perspective. From SIS, from MI6 perspective, there was Section D. Section D was formed very similarly to MIR, formed in 1938 to find alternative ways of fighting an enemy. And that included everything from resistance, but also black propaganda, fake news as we call it now, sabotage and other clandestine operations. So even pre-war, we as Britain had started to think about ways we could take on a German invasion of countries without using regular forces, using irregular forces, using the civilian population to help fight back. And that's where one of the groups we're going to talk about today, the auxiliary units, came from. As mentioned, this is Lawrence Grand, Royal Engineer. He headed up Section D as part of SIS MI6. So as I said, he was going around the country surrounding Nazi Germany, advising them, talking to them, realising ways that they can fight the enemy more effectively. It all came a bit too late. 38, 39, the Germans were already on the move. They were already entering the countries that he was talking to. And soon, after Dunkirk, it became pretty clear there wasn't other countries that needed this stuff, it was actually us. So he came back, he was called back, and he set up a thing called the Home Defence Scheme, which is essentially what he was doing with Section D in mainland Europe, but setting it up in Britain. Now, Grand was enthusiastic. I would say not your run-of-the-mill kind of MI6 type of chap, because he's quite gobby. And he was going around the country fairly liberally arming civilians with huge amounts of explosives and arms, without really telling them how to use them particularly, just getting it out there quick. He was also planting explosives in harbours and railway bridges without really telling anyone that he was doing it, and he was also burying large caches of weapons throughout the country, again, without recording where he had buried them, or him and his team. So he was certainly enthusiastic about the use of civilians within a resistance organisation. He was certainly capable of getting arms out there quickly. He recruited between May and middle of June 1,000 civilians. About 1,000 civilians were recruited the length of the country into his group, mainly focused in that kind of southeast corner, the most vulnerable point for invasion. However, he was a maverick. When Ironside CNC Home Forces got to hear about what was going on, he wasn't best pleased, to say the least. And that is also because the military... So the other thing is that this is obviously MI6 operating in the UK. MI6 obviously is the Foreign Secret Service. But because of their work with Section D on the continent, they just... the other thing is that MI5 in the early days didn't know what they were doing, and nor did the military initially either. So very, very secret. Difficult with Grand in charge, though. So Ironside, very annoyed that Grand and his team were arming civilians, but also because the military were also coming up with their own civilian resistance organisation ideas. So Anthony Eden, went down to 12 Corps, which is in that kind of Kent, Sussex area, and it was Andrew Thorne who's in charge down there. He was moaning to Eden about, rightly so, about the lack of anti-tank guns and lack of mobility. But also the conversation moved on to Thorne's time as military attaché in Berlin during the 30s. And part of the irony of the auxiliary units is that some of it comes from Germany. So Thorne was attaché in Berlin. He got to learn about the German peasant militia, which had been around since the 1700s. And their role was to bury arms on the land of their lord. And then when an enemy army came through, they would grab the arms, and what they lacked in terms of military training and in terms of numbers, they made up for in terms of the intimate knowledge of the countryside around them, the ability to move quickly at night, knowing where the best defensive positions were. And Thorne said to Eden, this might be something we can use in the UK. Eden took it straight back to Churchill, who obviously loved it. This is a perfect Churchill idea. Thorne was quickly invited up to lunch, boozy lunch, and the idea was then put into practice. Churchill contacted military intelligence research to start thinking about what this might look like practically, and to start to bring together some prototypes of what these civilian groups would look like. And they had a chap in mind who could start this. This is this chap, Peter Fleming, the brother of Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond. Peter began in Kent, near Bilting. He had a farmhouse called the Garth, and he was scouring the countryside around Kent and Sussex and recruiting people who had, like the German peasant militia, an intimate understanding of the countryside around them. Probably, so farmers, farm workers, gamekeepers, poachers, later quarrymen, miners, people who could handle weapons, could kill stuff, could handle explosives, but also had that intimate knowledge of where they were and how they could move quickly around at night particularly. And he started this thing called the 12 Corps Observation Unit, and recruited, I think 50 or 60 farmers, farm workers, those guys, and trained them with the help of his brother, who was in the Lovat Scouts, trained them in everything that would need to be an effective resistance group. Now, at this point, Ironside had had enough of Grand's antics and brought HDS and merged it with what Fleming was doing at 12 Corps Observation. And it was this point that it was clear that these groups were not for any long-term resistance. This isn't the French resistance. This is a short, sharp snap at the heel of the advancing German army. As such, they started to think about, they've got a short window to be effective. Can they go out, assassinate a British collaborator, blow up a railway track, and then come home to their wife and kids and spend the day? Probably not. Therefore, they're going to have to disappear. And this is where the idea of these underground bunkers started to come from as well at this really early stage. So this is kind of June, July 1940. Now, once these things have been combined, they brought in this chap, Colin Gubbins, who'd later head up SOE. He'd had a long history of irregular warfare. He'd fought in Ireland during the War of Independence. He'd been in the Allied intervention during the Russian Revolution. He'd been in Poland just as the Germans were coming through, and he'd headed up the independent companies in Norway during the Norwegian campaign, one of the few positives of that campaign. He took these combined groups and then moved them the length of the country to the vulnerable counties. So by its stand down in November 44, the auxiliary units were located from Orkney down the east coast of Scotland, northeast England, east coast, southeast corner, south coast, southwest, South Wales. There was nothing up from there to Scotland because there was no perceived threat from Ireland. 6,500 men were recruited entirely in secret. Why auxiliary units? Auxiliary units, they came up with the name because it doesn't mean anything. So if you're overheard chatting in the pub about the auxiliary units, it doesn't immediately say what you're up to. So Gubbins needed to extend these units quickly up the length of the country because obviously the threat of invasion was very, very real at that stage. So he recruited intelligence officers, many of whom he'd fought with alongside in the independent companies. Usually they would have some affiliation to the county that they were sent to. And their job was to go to the county, find a key man, as they called him, so a farm owner, farm worker, something like that, who was influential, but also had good connections with other people around him. Everyone had to sign the Official Secrets Act, and then they would basically choose the patrol leader and then leave to go and find the next area. The patrol leader, it would be up to the patrol leader then to recruit his own patrol and decide the area where their operational base, their bunker, would be. The first IO in Kent was Peter Fleming, which probably is no surprise given what he was up to. So in Kent, obviously a county prone to invasion. They had 9 groups of auxiliary unit patrols, usually between 7 or 8 patrols in each group. Unusually in Kent, they all had code names, each patrol, like Swede or Turnip or something like that. So again, they could be in the pub talking about it without anyone really thinking about what they were up to. Kent was also the only county to provide a bolt hole for auxiliary unit members if, for example, their operational base had been found, or if they'd been out on a mission and most of them had got killed. Near the Garth in Bilting, there was a airship, First World War airship hole where they prepared airships, and they dug a hole under the hole, thinking the Germans wouldn't look under a hole for another hole. And it was apparently, we think we know where it is, and some people say they went in there in the 90s. It's absolutely massive because this is room enough for kind of hundreds of auxiliary unit patrol members to scarper to if it all went wrong. So, what does a patrol look like? So, as I mentioned, the intelligence officer would go to a county, find the key man. The key man would then become the patrol leader, and it would be up to him to recruit his own patrol, usually made up of 6 to 8 men. Because of the secrecy, the patrol leader usually recruited friends, family, colleagues, people like that, as we'll see later, potentially risky. Lots of examples of gamekeepers recruiting poachers, because the gamekeeper knew that the poacher knew the land really well, could set traps, could move around silently and secretly. They all were familiar with the land, they could live off the land if necessary, and as I said, they were usually between 6 and 8 men, led by the sergeant, the patrol leader. Now, their role is not to take the Germans on head on. Their role is, as soon as the Germans move into their area, to disappear to their bunker and to stay there until the Germans literally sometimes have gone over the top of them. Their wives, their family, their friends would have absolutely no idea where they've gone. They didn't tell them anything because obviously their families would be immediately under suspicion because the head of the house had disappeared. So if you told them anything under torture, the wife could give it away. Also, once ensconced in their bunker, they'd have no outside orders. They'd be literally left on their own. The training was really, really high, as we'll see later, but they were trusted enough to make their own decisions. They'd have a list of initial targets, but they'd have no outside orders. So really siloed patrols, and each patrol wouldn't know where the next patrol's operational base or who was in it. In fact, in Essex in 2002, 2 brothers were having a chat on neighbouring farms, didn't realise they were also in neighbouring patrols during the war. It took that long, and that happens did happen all the time. This also isn't traditional fighting. This is dirty fighting. This is going into an airfield, killing a sentry and dismembering his body to scare his colleagues who found not only the wreckage of planes or a fuel dump, but a dismembered body. They had a fortnight's rations in the bunker, and that was essentially their life expectancy. I think a fortnight's probably pushing it. They were under orders to go out every night. They had such a short window to be effective. They couldn't have a night off. So every night they had to go out, blow up something, assassinate something, anything to slow down that German advance. And that's what it's about. During the Blitzkrieg in France and the Low Countries, the German spearhead kind of flew through while the supply chain kept them up to date with everything they need, with fuel, with ammo, with extra personnel. This is about slowing down that Blitzkrieg. This is about letting the spearhead go over the top of you, coming out at night and then blowing up fuel and ammo dumps, destroying railway lines, destroying convoys, destroying bridges, destroying airfields, destroying country houses that have been taken by Germans as their HQ, assassinating German officers, assassinating British collaborators. Utterly, utterly ruthless and brutal, and kind of goes against certainly my old perception of Britain in 1940 of kind of keep calm and carry on and drink cups of tea. This is brutal, brutal, brutal stuff. They also, because of the short window of being effective, they also had to assassinate people who knew about their existence or had got to find out about their existence. So the local policeman who would have to have checked their names when they first joined to make sure they weren't criminals, he would have to be assassinated because he had seen all their names together on a bit of paper. He wouldn't know what they were joining, but he would have seen all their names on a bit of paper. They would have to have assassinated the intelligence officer who'd brought them all together because he knew where all the patrols in that county were, who was in each patrol and where their bunker was. So the intelligence officer would have to be assassinated because if he got captured, that's it for that county, that's done. There's a chap still with us, probably, touch wood, the only surviving auxiliary called Ken Welch. He's down in Cornwall. He joined the auxiliary unit at the age of 16 because one night he followed his father, who was the patrol leader. He's like, he's up to something. What's he going? What's he disappearing to? Because he wasn't in the Home Guard. Followed him all the way to his operational base, and his dad found him there and was like, "Oh, what are you doing here?" Because his dad then had a choice to add Ken to a list of people to be assassinated as soon as the Germans arrived, or to allow him to join the auxiliary units. So he was lucky, and his dad let him join the auxiliary units. But for anyone else who'd found the operational base, so gamekeepers who happened to come across the bunker were added to lists. And so the first people potentially to be assassinated by the auxiliary units would have been innocent British civilians to allow them to continue to be operational for as long as possible. Weapons. So weapons, the auxiliary units were prioritised to an extent in the early days. We've got an update to Churchill talking about the formation of the auxiliary units, and he's scribbled on it, all of these men must have revolvers. So not just the officers, every single member of the auxiliary units in the summer of 1940 were handed revolvers, Smith & Wessons or whatever they could get their hands on, but every single one had them. They're also some of the first units later in the war to get hold of the Thompson submachine gun. So really prioritised, and it helped that Gubbins in the early days had knew Ironside really well, so they had that in with the CNC, and obviously Churchill loved the idea anyway. However, guns weren't really what the auxiliary units were about, because as soon as you fire a gun, you give away your position, and you're going to be found out. Saying that, explosives were really important, and they had a lot of explosives. Part of the importance of the auxiliary units is, during these early days in 1940, they were testing the pull switches and the pressure switches and the railway switches that would later be used by SOE in the French resistance. So they were testing these things to see how effective they were in these early days. And they had huge amounts of explosives. I'm just going to get my little book out here. In the 1960s, a chap called Reg Sinnott, who was a group commander of the auxiliary units, phoned up the police. He said, I've got a few bits and bobs left over from the war in my barn. The army were going to come and collect them. Would you mind coming along and grabbing them? So a couple of policemen turned up to his farm in Norfolk. They opened the barn, and in it they found 14,738 rounds of ammunition, 1,205 pounds of explosives, 3,742 feet of delayed action fusing, 930 feet of safety fuse, 144 time pencils, 1,207 long delay switches, 1,272 detonators, 719 booby trap switches, 314 paraffin bombs, 131 fog signals, 121 smoke bombs, 36 slabs of gun cotton, 33 time pencils and booby traps made up and ready to go. So they obviously crapped themselves and phoned up the bomb squad quickly. But that's the spares, right? That's the spares that he had to send round to his patrols as and when they needed them. So hugely prioritised in terms of explosives. To gain access to the thing they needed to blow up, they needed to do it quickly and silently. And so these were the main weapons of the auxiliary units. So the Fairbairn Sykes knife, knobkerries, anything they could get their hands on that could do damage to a sentry and allow them to gain access to the thing that they needed to destroy. And as I said, to dispatch sentries and to leave them in a horrible mess for their comrades to find. And if you think about it from a German perspective, they've come into it, if they did invade, they've come into an area, they probably didn't have maps. All they knew was that in the local area, their mates kept being killed, stuff keeps getting blown up, and they have no idea where these guys are coming from, just disappear and come back the next night. What we're essentially saying is it's not these guys. This is not what we're talking about. It's definitely not Dad's army, which I think is much of our perception of Britain in 1940, and much more like these guys. These guys are from a patrol in Hampshire, in Warsash, and as you can see, these are much more like commandos, much more like SAS. Young, fit men in reserved occupations, highly trained, determined, and utterly, utterly ruthless. This is another group in Dorset. I mean, you don't want to run into these boys in a dark alley. And a good example here is that we've got two brothers here. The thing about the patrol leader recruiting friends, family, colleagues is that because of your short window to be effective, if one of your patrol members is injured and can't get back to your operational base, you cannot let them fall into the hands of the Germans. So you either have to leave them with enough ammo to take out a few Germans and then themselves, or you have to kill that person yourself. So if you are brothers here, if you are Ken's dad and Ken gets injured on the way back from a mission, you've got really hard decisions to make, really hard decisions to make. And they're not bloodthirsty killers, they're not psychos. They're ordinary blokes who understood that bigger picture that if the country had fallen, particularly in the summer of 1940, that's it, that's game over. America isn't, the US isn't in the war. For the empire to come and liberate Britain and Europe, that's a huge effort without Britain leading that call. The resistance forces in Europe always had Britain as a hope, as a point of liberation, that something could be jumped off from. If Britain had fallen, that's it, game over. And these guys, when you talk to them, when you did talk to them, pretty much understood that and were willing to do that level of ruthlessness, not because they wanted to, but because they knew they had to. So we've talked quite a bit about the operational bases. To begin with, patrols would dig them themselves, but unless you had a very kind of specific set of skills within your patrol, they were usually pretty rubbish, like breathing underground's quite difficult, that kind of stuff. So later they got in Royal Engineer tunnelling companies to come and dig them, and these were the most remarkable groups, and I need to get in your archives. Because these guys, 25 men, one officer, would travel around, move into Devon. So for example, in Devon where I'm from, they would bring in a Royal Engineer unit from Newcastle, or even Canadians, who would then come down, build them quickly and then leave. Because what you don't want to do is use a Devon Royal Engineer group for them all to be captured and then just take the Germans to each patrol. So they use them, and they used to dig them within 24, 48 hours. And they, as we'll see in a minute, the most remarkable structures. And the levels of ingenuity are incredible. There's no standard design, but there are common features. So when you go into the main compartment, it's like a big Anderson shelter, like big elephant iron. There's often an escape tunnel, although most patrol members that we've spoken to realise that if the Germans are at your entrance hatch, you're pretty much done for. So sometimes they didn't bother digging them. There's often an OP located on high ground that was attached by telephone wire. So during the day, when the patrol are resting and planning for the next night's mission. One of the patrol would be awake in the OP, looking for targets, but also to warn them if there's a German patrol coming through. And there's always a disguised entrance. So a little cut through here. So this is the entrance hatch here. So the entrance hatch is disguised in a multitude of ways, but it's flat to the surface. It's completely flush with grass and debris kind of stuck to it. You can enter that in various ways depending on the bunker. Sometimes it's a counterweight mechanism where you stamp on it and it flips up and flips around and allows you to go in. Sometimes there's a fake tree root which you pull, which either rings a bell in the bunker so your guys can let you in, or it activates the counterweight system and pulls it up and swivels it around. Some patrols were issued different colour, each member has different coloured marbles, and they take the marble and roll it down what looked like a mouse hole, roll underground and rattle in a tin, and that would allow you to get in. And once the hatch is open, you kind of go down 15, 16 steps, so quite deep. There's usually a blast wall there, just in case the Germans have found you there, drops a grenade down. There's usually, horrifically, a Elson chemical toilet, which for 2 weeks with really nervous men would be pretty grim, I imagine, by the end of that. And then you're into the main chamber where you've got the elephant iron over the top of you. This is where the bunks are, the table for planning. This is where you're resting during the day. Then through to the next chamber. Sometimes they'd have a kitchen. So kitchens aren't ideal for remaining secret. So they'd funnel the chimney up a hollow tree, so the smoke dispersed at the top of the tree line rather than through the forest. Then into here, this is some storage. They didn't store their explosives there because that's mental, so they would store it elsewhere, but easy to get hold of. And then through to an escape tunnel. And the escape tunnels, as I said, were pretty much there to give them some hope, but there was little hope. But they would always come out in a disguised area. So it might be in the middle of a bank, it might be in the middle of the wall when part of the wall rolled away. There's one example we've just found in Devon near Branscombe where the escape tunnel comes up and it's disguised as a badger set. So there's lots of badger sets around it and it's disguised as a badger set so you can pop up. The most remarkable things, and we're still finding them intact. A couple of years ago, Forestry Commission found one completely intact in Scotland with bunks in, tables, because these things at the end of the war were literally shut up and forgot about. They just didn't, the army was meant to go around and destroy them, but the nature of these means they're quite hard to find, so they gave up quite often. I thought I'd just do very quickly, go for a relatively local patrol, because weirdly, a lot of the patrols around here, we don't know where their OBs are. So, little task for you there, anyone who lives locally, go and have a look, pull down a hole. But Donington's a good example of the type of men that they recruited. So we got, haulage contractor, farmer, fruit dealer, farmer, cowman, butcher, local people with a good understanding of the countryside and could and potentially kill stuff, certainly leave a sentry in a pretty nasty way. The Donington patrol, the operational base, we don't know where it is, but tantalisingly, we've got a picture of this chap. I think this is George Chesson. George Chesson is standing here in front of a yew tree somewhere. We've just got the picture, we don't know where the yew tree is. The bunker's under here. So his OB was in a 4-chamber chalk well underneath a large yew tree there. And this is another good example of the types of kind of level of ingenuity involved. They cut the roots of the yew tree with a razor blade, lifted it up, put the hatch there, then reattached the roots to each other. So when you lifted up the OB, it would all come up together. But on the surface, it looked like roots just going over the surface. It's Henry Cuthbert. This is what he said. 1 week a month, so they had to get used to living underground, obviously. They couldn't eat anything smelly. So they also linked up to telephones, which is for the OPs. Quite a few were found in the 70s, and farmers used to dump their rubbish in them. But he went down there, and as quite often was found, there were still ammo boxes. There's one example in Devon, up Holden Hill, which goes up towards the racecourse. They're widening the road in the 1970s. Big JCB kind of digging out. Just suddenly this old bloke's running up the hill saying, no, you better, don't, you've got to stop. An old patrol member, because this JCB is about to go through the roof of the OB, stacked full of explosives, stacked full. And this is one good example. So they had marbles. So they had a marble hidden under a leaf. He would throw it down a mouse hole, 12-inch pipe into a tin can, and then the men would let them in. So anyone lives near Donington, you happen to find that tree there, give me a shout, because there's a bunker underneath it. Just round here, there are, and we don't know where any of these are, in terms of actual locations of the bunkers, number 1 group and number 6 group. So here we are, and it kind of shows you where they located them as well. So you don't want to be right on the coast. You don't want to be right up on the coast because you're going to get swept up with any kind of initial stage of invasion. You want to be kind of 5-6 miles inland to allow the Germans to kind of get through and over the top of you. And basically they were around major roads, major railways or near key targets. But that's just, and this is just 2 groups. I mean, there's loads here. We don't know where any of them are. To be effective, to allow these groups to be effective in the small time window, they obviously had to be trained to a really high level. They were trained at a place called Coleshill House, which is near Highworth, near Swindon. 2 or 3 of the patrol would get a letter saying, you have to come to Coleshill for some training this weekend, get a train to Highworth, and then go to the local post office. They'd get off the train, they'd go to the post office, where they would meet the postmistress, Mabel Stranks, by all accounts a fairly miserable elderly lady. Give them a code word, something like, I need 2 first-class stamps, but I've only got this much money. She would then go out the back, phone up Coleshill House and say, I've got more of your guys here, check their credentials, and then Coleshill House would send a truck round, drive a convoluted route back to Coleshill House, so by the time these guys ended up there, they had no idea where they were. And at Coleshill, they would get all the training they would need. So they'd be trained in digging bases initially, but also then living in bases. They'd be trained in silent combat, how to move at night across fields. They had German tanks and German planes there, so the best places to place the explosives on. Everything that you would need to know. Obviously, the nature of these chaps meant they couldn't tell their wives what they're up to, so quite a few wives thought that quite a few of the auxiliary units were having affairs, and not very subtle ones, because they were disappearing at weekends without being able to tell them where they were going. Coleshill House, unfortunately, burnt down shortly after the war, but as Tim said, the outhouses are still there. They built, about 10 years ago, the most fantastic mock-up bunker in perfect working order. It's got the tree root which you pull, which rings a bell. It's absolutely, so if you're ever in the area, I highly recommend. It's now owned by the National Trust. When the patrol members weren't going to Coleshill House, they were trained by what are called scout sections, not scouts, but made up of regular soldiers who formed their own patrol. So in Kent, there were 2 or 3 scout sections, I think, who were training locally the patrols, and then if the Germans had come, the scout sections would have made up their own auxiliary unit as well, so they would have undergone activity. So that's the AUX units. AUX units are small window to be effective, blow up stuff, kill as many people as you can to slow up the German advance. The other part of the story we're going to tell today is the Special Duties Branch, which is kind of the other side from the auxiliary units. This again rose from Grand's work with HDS. So we had the Ruthless blowing up bit, but also the intelligence gathering bit, which is much more in line with kind of SIS MI6. Under Grand, he recruited key men again in towns and villages, who then recruited their own cells of spies and runners. And then when it came under the military, they introduced wireless sets. So the recruitment is very different. So instead of young, fit farmers and farm workers and gamekeepers, they're recruiting the elderly. They're recruiting mothers, they're recruiting doctors, they're recruiting vicars, recruiting publicans, people who could stay on their street as the German army passed through. They were really highly trained in insignia, in weapons in vehicles and direction of travel. They'd write all this information down on a piece of edible paper, stuck it under their tongue. They'd then take it to a dead letter drop. So this might be something like a OXO cube tin on a windowsill or a loose brick in a graveyard. Then a runner would see that it was there, pick it up, take it onto the next dead letter drop. It would end up with a civilian wireless operator. So in South Wales, there's an example of a vicar who had his wireless set under the altar with an aerial going up the steeple using the lightning rod as a disguise. He would then be sending this information on to ATS women who are also in secret bunkers, who would then send it on to GHQ and local command. And this is all about taking the mystery out of the blitzkrieg. In France and the Low Countries, the Germans would speed through, just turn up, and civilians would be on the road. No one had any idea where they were going, what they were aiming for. This is about taking that mystery out. There's this many of them, they're of this regiment, they've got this many vehicles, they've got this many weapons. This gives GHQ and local command the opportunity to make informed, timely decisions about British counterattack. Really well thought out, really well prepped in the summer of 1940. The auxiliary units, even though they're operating in exactly the same place as the Special Duties Branch, they had no idea about each other on the whole, apart from in Kent, where a patrol member, I think it was the Linstead Patrol, was patrolling his woods. He comes across, I haven't got this later on, have I? No. Comes across a hatch to a bunker, and he's like, it's a bit too close to my bunker to be another auxiliary unit patrol. What's going on here? Finds a way in, goes down the ladder. He's confronted at the bottom by an ATS woman pointing a revolver at his head. All she knows is this heavily armed guy in denims has entered her bunker. All he knows is this woman seems to have a bunker and loads of wireless sets. What's going on here? They agree not to kill each other. And thank God, because they got married. So much better than online dating. But of course, they both signed the Official Secrets Act, so they could tell no one how they met. Such an amazing story. Eventually they did, obviously. That's how we know. Some examples of dead letter drops. So, as well as kind of OXO cube tins and loose bricks, more sophisticated. Gate bolts here. So in Norfolk, there was a gate with a shoe horse. The shoe horse is facing up, no message. Facing down, there was a message. In the side of the gate was a fake bolt. You unscrewed the top of the bolt, and it's hollow, and that's where the message is. Pull it out. You can be on your way. Keys were really good. So keys left in church doors, for example. Turn sideways, you can see there's a message. The top of the key unscrews, and that's hollow, and the message can be left in there. All of this is designed so you can do it in plain sight during the day. You don't have to be messing about at night. The tennis ball, split tennis ball, is for, they had fake tree stumps with revolving tops. You put the message in the split tennis ball, pop it down the tree stump, it'd roll underground, either to the next dead letter drop, or as we'll see later, to a wireless operator. Just amazing levels of ingenuity. Lots and lots of Special Duties Branch stuff going on in Kent. Hollingbourne is the dating site, but lots and lots going on here. Tunbridge Wells and Manston were, like Hollingbourne, were ATS in stations, they're called, but the rest are all civilian groups. Up until about 3 weeks ago, we thought we had a pretty good handle on the Special Duties Branch and the number of people involved in each group. We thought there's probably about one key man with the wireless set, maybe 4 or 5 runners, maybe 5 or 6 spies. We unearthed some paperwork which had been wrongly filed in Wales, and it turns out there were 50 or 60 members of each cell, certainly within Wales. So if we then take that information and we did think there were 4,500 members of the Special Duties Branch. I think we're going to have to very quickly inflate that significantly. All of these guys, again, signed the Official Secrets Act. Didn't tell anyone what they're up to at all. I'd say 90% of the auxiliary units in Special Duties Branch went to the grave without telling anyone, wives, family, friends. I'm about to show you a video, and 1, because it gives me a break, 2, because it's the most remarkable thing I think you'll see, certainly today, possibly this week. It's a Special Duties Branch civilian wireless bunker. I hope it's working. Okay. This is on, it's in the Axminster on the Devon-Dorset border. So, Germans have triangulated a signal. They know there's something going on here or around this area. They walk past this building, open it up. It's an outside toilet, ladies and gentlemen. Nothing to see here. Pretty grim. They can even go in and give it a test. Have a look, there's a nice bucket. Nothing to see there at all.
I can't lift this up at all unless you trip the release mechanism.
However, when you go back outside, there's a small water meter hatch here. You open up said hatch, and there's a small key there. Turn the key 90 degrees. He eventually does it. Come on, Martin. There we go. You go back to the outside toilet, because that is a release mechanism, which now allows you to do this. So, ladder going down into a bunker. It's really quite narrow, so Martin does well here. Down into the bunker, there's a small, as we'll see, there's a small corridor. And then into, even if the Germans got this far, a weirdly disguised Anderson shelter. So you go in, with some tables and chairs here, obviously some air vents to allow you to breathe. Looks normal until you pull that hook, and that hook opens up a fake wall, which is there behind that table. You can push down the bench. Bear with him, he gets going in a minute. So the bench pulls down, the table pulls up, so you can then pull up the fake wall. And behind there, as we'll see, is where the wireless operator would have been sat. Next to him, where he's got sat, his wireless set's in the wall there. Next to him, he's got like a handbrake which he can pull, which brings the toilet back down and locks it in place. So there's Martin moving the wall. The idea of this fake wall is if the Germans had got as far as that first chamber, this gives him time to radio onto the ATS women. The Germans are here right now. This is my final message. Destroy his wireless set and commit suicide.
Side and the doorway.
So there we are. That's into where the wireless was. You'll see in a minute, next to the wireless set is a little hole. On the border surrounding the house is a hedge. In the middle of the hedge is one of these revolving tree stumps, where the last runner in the line would put the message in the tennis ball, pop it down the tree stump, it rolls all the way underground and ends up next to him, and he can pass that information on. It's absolutely incredible. A lot of the wireless cables in. Anyway, there we are. I mean, that is unbelievable, isn't it?
What was going to be
Built by Royal Engineers, quickly and effectively. So we have the auxiliary units blowing up stuff. We have the Special Duties branch passing on the information to the regular forces. As the threat of invasion diminished, moving into later in the war, the auxiliary units' role changed into kind of anti-raiding, just in case the Germans were raiding. They guarded the royal family when they were in residence at Sandringham and at Balmoral. Lots of patrols throughout the country were sent to the Isle of Wight during D-Day to protect the island just in case of German counterattack. Another thing we've just found out about the Special Duties branch is that in the run-up to D-Day, they were spying on the British population and using the network to pass along any information of people who were talking about the invasion or the forthcoming invasion. So any servicemen who were in pub who were overheard by a member of the Special Duties branch, that information would be sent across that network and sent on to GHQ, and that bloke would be pulled and punished or taken off. Special Duties branch was stood down in July 1944. November 44, all units were stood down. The regular personnel, so those scout sections we talked about, went first. Between 300 and 500 of these scout section members joined 1st SAS. They were invited to a cinema by Paddy Mayne in February 1944 to see a film about the SAS. He turned the lights back on and said, look, I know you guys are really highly trained in this stuff. Anyone who doesn't want to join the SAS, I'm going to turn the lights down now and you can leave. Lights went down. Obviously no one was going to say no to Paddy, so they all joined up. Quite a few of them died in operations in kind of June, July, August 1944, as they were sent in to help do the opposite of what they were doing in Britain, so to help protect an invasion rather than prevent one, doing exactly the same stuff as they were trained to do. Explosives were collected, as we've seen, not very successfully. Operational bases were meant to be blown up, not very successfully. They were given a stand-down letter. This is one we found in the paperwork of a lady who died fairly recently. It's a special duties one. Basically, it said the same as the auxiliary unit one. Thanks for your service, you're not going to get any public recognition. Done. Don't talk about it to anyone. The auxiliary unit members were lucky enough to be not given, because they had to pay for them, a small lapel badge, which of course is pretty useless because the only other people who know about that, what that means, are other members of the auxiliary units. Ken, the chap who's still alive, who nearly got assassinated by his dad, was in a hotel in the mid-50s at some kind of conference. What did he say to me? He said he went to go and point Percy at the porcelain, and whilst he was there, another chap stood next to him with the lapel badge on, the same as Ken had on. They just nodded at each other and got on the way. And that's exactly the type of chaps they were. They didn't say anything, one, because they signed the Official Secrets Act, and because they're of that generation that once you've signed, that's it. Secondly, they were asked to do horrendous things to their own community if the Germans had come. That's not something you can boast about. And thirdly, for many of them, they didn't think they'd done anything because they weren't called upon. And part of what I do, what we do as the Coleshill Auxiliary Research Team is try and get them the recognition. It's too late for almost all of them. But what they were prepared to do, what they were prepared to sacrifice, should be remembered. It shouldn't be written out of history. It's not Dad's army, it's not just Spitfires. These guys were incredibly prepared, were going to be brutal, and the country as a whole was hugely prepared. So that should be, if anything should be the takeaway, that should be it today. So thank you very much. Any questions, really happy to take them. Thank you. Hello.
How did you first find out about this?
Good question. So personally, I did a history degree, thought I had a pretty good understanding of Britain in 1940. Then I read a book by a chap called David Lamp, an American who wrote it in 1968. And this book it's called Last Ditch. The book came out and all the surviving auxiliaries were like, what the? We've all signed the Official Secrets Acts, and this American can come along, just write about us all. Anyway, I read this book and was completely blown away about it. Because of the slight scandal that was caused in 68, from then, there was nothing at the end of the war. 68, the book came out, and then nothing until the files were released in the early 2000s. So I read this book. CART, the Coleshill Auxiliary Research Team, was just being formed. My day job was a PR man, so I said, do you want a press officer? And now this is much more exciting and interesting than my day job. So. Hello.
So how many more hidden bunkers do you think there might be?
It's really, so we can only tell when there's the information that was released is basically in 43, 44, they recorded all the known names and addresses of auxiliary unit members at that point, because we think now they are really highly trained saboteur guerrilla fighters, could be really useful in a future conflict. Let's keep an eye on where they are. Let's see where they are. So we've got all these lists of names and addresses, and what we do is we then group them together as to where they live near to each other, and then think, okay, so they're all the north point of this town. There's a copse here, that's quite near these targets here. Let's go and have a look there. We think, well, we found, with the help of the public, we think we found about 400, 500 bunkers. I think there's probably another same again to find, because lots of patrols had two, because one got discovered or got flooded and they had to build another one. I think there's still a lot out there.
And what are you doing, or what's being done with the ones that have been discovered? Are they looked after?
Not really. It's a really between a rock and a hard place with this stuff, because if it's listed, so the Hollingbourne Special Duties Branch, the ATS bunker, is listed by English Heritage. In order to gain that, you then have to put the coordinates publicly available. And then you get idiots on YouTube who are like, oh, I've just discovered this. No, you haven't. But they destroy it. I mean, it's complete. When it was first discovered, it was pristine. And now it is completely trashed. Graffiti, all the bunks are being smashed up. Most of the stuff is on private land. And most of them, to be honest, have collapsed in some form or another because they weren't designed to be of any longevity. But what we do is we find them, record them on our website, but we don't put any location stuff. And we've decided not to try and go for listing because actually it does more harm than good.
It's a conundrum, isn't it?
Really interesting. Because to get protection, they are then suddenly unprotected. Brilliant. Thank you very much, everyone.